Does your child forget instructions as soon as you give them? Or maybe they lose track of what they wanted to say in the middle of a conversation? These struggles with verbal working memory can make it hard for kids to manage daily tasks, manage their schoolwork, and even social interactions, which can cause so many big emotions in them and so much frustration and misunderstanding from us as parents. My hope with this episode here is to really start diving in and understanding more of what could be taxing our kids that we didn't even realize so that we can support them better and really help decrease the meltdowns. Welcome to the Kids with Big Emotions podcast. I am your host, Andi Clark. When I first started learning about executive functioning, it was a game changer in understanding and supporting my son with his big emotions. I felt like I had finally found a huge missing piece of the puzzle. And now I want to share that with you in this executive functioning series. This series dives into the foundational layers of executive functioning skills. These skills aren't just about getting organized or managing time. They're the backbone of how we regulate emotions, which is directly tied to the big feelings our kids experience, like anger, anxiety, and frustration. Think of executive functioning like an orchestra. Imagine the conductor trying to guide each section as he's struggling. The strings come in too early. The horns are playing too loudly. And while some parts are on track, even one or two sections being off can throw the entire piece out of harmony. That's what happens when the conductor of our executive functioning system struggles. It impacts how everything flows together. Mood regulation, social cues, how we make it through our day with focus, planning, organization, and more. Through this series, we'll break down the sections of the executive functioning orchestra, helping you understand how to bring them into harmony so your child and your family can thrive. Let's dive in. So, verbal working memory is the ability to hold and manipulate verbal information, phonetical sounds, the phonics, in the mind for short periods of time. So this could be like a couple of seconds that they're able to hold this information, the sounds, the words, the phrases, and the sentences in their mind. And this is crucial for tasks that involve following multi-step instructions. So giving your child instructions, giving them directions, they may not be able to follow instructions if they can't hold the information long enough. Remembering what somebody said, remembering a conversation, remembering what a teacher said in class, or even long enough to make the notes for it in class. It really depends on the child, depends on how long they can hold those conversations and how much they can hold. And all of this is your verbal working memory. So if we think of it like this, we often talk about I'm saying, when I'm in these worlds with kids that are getting tested for gifted testing, for different psychoeval testing, quite often there will be a marker, a data set, a number beside working memory. And people are like, what the heck does this mean? That's what I used to say. I used to be like, what is working memory? I don't really understand this. Working memory is split into two pieces: your verbal working memory, which is what we're diving into today, and nonverbal working memory, which is what we will dive into in the next lesson, in the next episode. And both of them are important. The thing that does frustrate me is in a psychoeval, or when you're putting something in a kid's IEP or anything like that, when they're giving strategies for these kids with a weaker working memory, is the strategies that you're going to use if it's a verbal working memory versus a nonverbal working memory struggle is very, very, very different. And quite often I see where people are like, oh, working memory, and they're doing one certain thing. I'm like, you're missing aspects of it, or they're missing steps. And who I learned executive functioning from is a speech and language pathologist. And She stated Tara Sumner. And Tara Sumner, about 20 years ago in her practice, she realized that most speech and language struggles stem from executive functioning, and the verbal or or the nonverbal working memory usually plays a large part in this. And it can cause so many frustrations when a teacher continues to try to work on phonics with your child, work on their reading, work on their writing, and the child continues to struggle with it. That's when we need to start looking at a different way, which is that verbal or nonverbal working memory. But as we just said too, it affects the verbal working memory is sounds. It's the memory of sounds, the memory of phonics. So any word has a sound to it. Even if we say gibberish, or let's say we're learning a new language and it's the same word, or like cat. And now we have to learn sha. That is your verbal working memory, learning the different sounds for words, learning the different sounds that go in a phrase, in a sentence. It's the sounds that we're taking in, the phonological sounds. And that's the verbal part. So anything that's verbal that you're taking in auditorily from that. So something like jump or cat, or remembering 3 words. He likes apples. We're remembering the words, right? The nonverbal working memory, which I'll dive way deeper in the next one, just the quick and dirty of a nonverbal, are the images that portrays in your mind. So when I said he likes apples, if you're going on video with this, if you're looking at my slide deck, that there's actually a boy eating an apple. I know I'm envisioning this boy eating an apple. He really likes it. There's a smile on his face. I imagine what it tastes like, what it smells like. That is all your verbal, your nonverbal working memory. When I say jump, I'm imagining somebody jumping in the air and having fun, and the way that, their hair moves, the way their clothes move, the way the sound is, all of that is your nonverbal working memory. So it's not the word itself, it's how that word stimulates all of your senses, that visual imagery in your mind. So that's the difference between nonverbal and verbal. Today we're diving into verbal. So one of the amazing researchers into executive functioning, especially into the working memory, is Badley and Hitch. And they have something that they call the phonological loop. That's where we're kind of self-talk, inner talk, repeating the words in our mind. So if we have a grocery list, and that grocery list, we're repeating bread, milk, ice cream, bread, milk, ice cream, so that we don't have to constantly look at the list. We can kind of look around and see what we're looking for. If it's a couple of items in the fruit section or the produce section, we could be thinking, apples, oranges, bananas, and not have to look at our list for all 3 things. So it's trying to remember those things. And we have this phonological loop where we are repeating, or that self-talk of, and that inner voice, that is all your phonological loop. When we're learning, we really require the verbal working memory. Now, we first need to work on perception. So if somebody is struggling with phonological sounds, they first need to perceive that what they're saying is different than what somebody else is saying. So this is where these skills all build on one another. We have covered perception and we've covered attention because they are so important. You first have to pay attention to what somebody's saying, and then you have to perceive if what you're saying is the same thing as they say. So that's where you may find some kids in school, they might say g instead of d, right? That's when they're not perceiving that what they're saying is different. So you might say, oh, g. Or they're saying d. I say, where does your tongue, where is your tongue when you're saying that? And they'll say, oh, d, the roof of my mouth. Great, g. When I say g, where is the force? Where is my tongue coming? And it's like the back of the mouth. So they start to perceive first that it's different before they can actually change and work on this verbal working memory to remember what the sounds sound like. So this is where perception builds on these things. So if a child has perception struggles, they may struggle with verbal working memory, with the phonetic sounds of things. If we think of a baby, so a baby, when a mom's saying bottle, the baby might start saying ba, ba. And then they might get to ba for bottle, because they realize that it's two sounds, ba, ba, ba. But they're repeating the same sound. Eventually, they might get to bata, if they're perceiving that what they're saying is different. And as they start learning how to move their tongue and learning how to work their mouth, and eventually they say bottle. So this works over time with these kids to start being able to figure out how their whole mouth moves, how the structure moves, and then the ability to remember the sound. That's part of the verbal working memory, is the remembering of the sound once they have gotten to understand and know what that sound sounds like. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Like, this has to do with reading and writing. The thing is that this all puts stress on a child. And what you'll find as well is when you're working with a child on reading, I remember speaking with somebody before I learned this a couple of years ago. And they had said that their child works with a tutor in the mornings because their reading is better in the mornings. And now that I understand this, I'm like, oh, because they've gone through their entire day, they're more exhausted, they've put more, more on their plate, they're more stressed, they're more taxed, and their executive functioning system is more taxed, which tells me that that child's reading struggle is not an inability to read. They don't need to keep practicing and practicing and practicing the same words. It's understanding and working the executive functioning system so that they are perceiving the words, or that they can actually start remembering those words, the sounds that they're supposed to be saying. Because once they're taxed more and more and more, their ability to remember the phonological sounds will decrease. So you'll find that a child, I mean, we see this with ourselves when we're tired, when we've had like a really good night the night before, we've been out, we've been partying, we may struggle with our words the next day. And that is a child that is struggling with their executive functioning system. So understanding that when they're stressed and they start struggling with words, or when they're struggling more with their reading or their homework, or understanding when you're helping them with their homework, they may not remember what the words that they're reading. They may not be able to remember them when their executive functioning system is taxed, because that decreases the length that they can remember those words, phrases, sounds, sentences. I said that all in the wrong order, but going from smaller to larger, the larger ones they may not remember as well as the smaller ones, which brings me right now to word chains. Now, this is where I found this completely fascinating, and this is going to help you see how much we're taxing our executive functioning system without even realizing it with some of these kids. When a child is struggling with their verbal working memory, we might think that because a word is a one-syllable word, so is one of them, we think of so or us, sit, spy, ask, slip, list, spent, splint. We think of these words and we think, oh, they're one syllable. The child should be able to remember them all the same. The thing is from an executive functioning system, as I said these words, they increased in difficulty. So and us are two-letter words that are a consonant and a vowel together. That's easier to remember than the next one, which is a three-letter word that's a consonant, vowel, consonant. So is easier for them to remember than sit. Three-letter words. They have to think it. That's three phonological sounds they need to remember for that word. And then we go to spy and ask. Those are both still three-letter words, but they're consonant vowel, or a vowel consonant words. The two consonants are beside each other, which makes those very distinct sounds to say. Sp, I, ask. it actually puts more strain. It requires more energy from that child to be able to remember the phonological sounds of that word. So we're taxing their memory more. We go one step further to slip or list, which is two consonants together and a vowel and a consonant. Remember, as soon as we have those two consonants together, it becomes harder. And we also have 4 letters for them to be able to pronounce. S-l-i-p, slip. That's 4 phonological sounds, even though it's still one, oh my gosh, one syllable. It's still one syllable long. And so when we're working with a child that's struggling with verbal working memory or struggling with their phonics, we have to be so cognizant of making sure that we are working at, this is called a word chain, when we're talking about how many letters are in each word and what the sound order is. Those are word chains. One simple change can make a world of a difference if a child can or cannot remember the sounds. That is a quote by Tara Sumner, the SLP that I learned executive functioning from. And she's the one that taught me about these word chains. And this is so important because we may find that a child keeps stumbling on sit or stumbling on spy, like these 3-letter words. And we keep asking them to repeat them over and over again instead of going back and teaching them the 2 letters first. Go back to where they're very successful and work on the successes there before we start moving up. And this is where a child can feel like a failure. This is where a child can feel that they are struggling, and it can create so many big emotions in class when the teacher keeps asking them to remember the phonetic sounds, but asking them to do it in a way that is harder for them to comprehend. Now, here's another one that we assume is actually easier, but it's harder than what I just said to you about moving up in a letter. If a teacher asks, what's the first sound in a word? And we're going to use the word sat for this example. If the teacher says, what's the first sound in sat? This is all that a child has to do, all of the steps that a child has to do to remember the words in sat. They have to hold the question, what's the first sound? They have to remember the word. So they have to first remember, okay, what's the first sound? And then they have to remember, shoot, what's the word? Oh, the word sat. Okay. Now they have to remember each sound in sat. That's a 3-letter sound put together, at. Then they have to go back and remember, okay, what was the first letter? What was the letter that I was supposed to sound out for you? And then they only have to repeat one sound to you. So they think sat, sat. Okay, what's the first letter? They have to think of the letter, they have to think of the sound, and then they have to repeat only that sound to you. And then you go, okay, great. Now let's do it again. They have to go through all of those steps again. And sometimes that's too many steps. So if we go back up to planning, which is a higher level skill, that might be too high of a skill for them. They may not be able to do that many steps yet. So it might be a higher level planning skill they can't do. It might be, if we look up to analyzing is a higher level executive level skill. They may not be able to analyze the letter well enough to be able to break it down into 3. And we start thinking of other things too, just even self-correcting. They may not be able to self-correct themselves on, or self-modulate even, or sorry, self-monitor themselves to figure out which is the letter that they need to be focusing on. So there's so many different higher level executive functioning skills put into this skill of asking a child this question. And when their executive functioning system is struggling at all in any of these, it can be hard. And that's where we can get even a gifted child that is so highly gifted and can tell you words and can read till the cow comes home, but then you ask them a question like this and they may stumble. And that's because it's asking for higher level executive functioning skills that child may struggle with. Kind of break down too, asking a child to break down math, right? The math sounds That gets into nonverbal working memory because we're working with symbols, but you're also asking them to remember all of the steps to put them down on paper. And they may not be able to actually inhibit themselves long enough to pause and think about the steps and that higher level skill of planning. They may not be able to just plan out all those steps, more than one step, maybe more than they are able to do at this point. And it may blow your mind because you're sitting here thinking, but my child is so smart, if they're like a gifted child, or they are so smart, but they can't pass a test to get into gifted. And you're like, what is going on? Like, this child is just way ahead. And the thing is, that's where we start looking at the executive functioning struggles, which creates so many different struggles in our kids. So the next one too, that we think is easy, but is more complex, is if we were to say sat without the S and say, what's the new word? And teachers do this quite often. And that's when they find that kids start really struggling with the phonics, with the sounds. But we think about this. They have to first hold the original sound, the original word. Then they have to hold the direction that was given to them. And they may not be able to hold that long enough. And then they may drop the word and then they can't follow the direction. And you know that this child can do individually all the sounds. So it may not even be the phonological sounds. It's that we're giving them too many directions, that they can't keep that many directions in their head. And that's where we may need to like start writing things down and eventually start working that part of the brain so that you don't have to write it down as much, so that they can keep more of those directions in their head. But we think these are higher level planning skills. We ask these kids quite often to follow these plans that have so many steps in them. And they might be okay with the phonics. They might be okay with the individual sounds, but we start adding so many steps and they can't hold that many steps in. So it's really, really important to start thinking of where, how many steps am I giving this child? Are they dropping things at certain steps? Or is it when things get larger? Or like if we're going, maybe they're okay with words, but they're not okay with phrases or sentences, and then they're not okay with phrases. Or it might be that paragraphs stump them. So it's how much of a cognitive load can they take on, that their verbal working memory may be very strong in some things and then struggle with others. My husband's verbal working memory is unbelievable. And he can remember names, dates of people, like unbelievable. He can remember these small little details about somebody, like, well, how many kids they have, those small things. But when we start getting into him actually following a conversation, knowing a storyline, having images for things, which is what we'll talk about next, which is nonverbal working memory, he struggles. But because he's so smart, he has compensated and masked so long in his life that it is only once I started learning executive functioning that we realized how much he struggles in his nonverbal working memory and how strong his verbal working memory is. So you may have a child that can name out stats like there's no tomorrow. They can go through history, or they can go through, chemistry and periodic table of elements and know all of these things, but they may not be able to follow directions or follow a conversation you have. And that's where they can handle things in those smaller cognitive loads and remember them to crazy details. But the longer that information gets, that's where they struggle. That's where the break in that part of the system is for them. So it's absolutely fascinating when you start diving into this. Now, as I've said on the other two, on perception and attention, in the last two episodes or lessons, is that our executive functioning system, you may notice that when a child is young, they may struggle with these things and then they may outgrow them. And this is fascinating with the verbal working memory, because you may find that a child, may struggle when they're young and then they may grasp it with smaller words, but then the books start getting bigger and they struggle with bigger words, bigger books. They may struggle with more textbook stuff. When the words start getting more intricate, when you have more of a phonological sound, or the cognitive load in order to remember the phrases, the sentences, the amount of information they're supposed to remember increases, that's when they may struggle. So you might find that through different ages and stages, they're good, and then they struggle. And then it might take them a bit. They may figure that stage out. It may take them longer than some other kids to be able to work through that and get it. And then when they get to another stage that has a higher cognitive load, they may struggle. I know for me, pregnancy, I know I said this in the last episode too. I said this in the perception one. When I got pregnant, that was a stage where my whole stress system was taxed. I struggled with simple things like remembering words. I could open the fridge. Oh, that's a visual. That's nonverbal working memory because I'm visually seeing something, but not even be able to take in what I have in the fridge, let alone what do I need to make a sandwich. So I couldn't even follow the small things. Couldn't remember 20 plus 20, which is just, simple. I couldn't spell out names. Couldn't remember anyone's name to save my life. And that's because the cognitive load placed on me when I was pregnant taxed my stress system so much, which I'm now realizing I have a very weak nonverbal, or I have a very weak verbal. My husband's is strong. Mine is weak. I have relied on him through our whole marriage to remember other people's names, other dates, all that stuff. I'll ask him those things. Thing is I am phenomenal with conversations, and I can remember storylines and plots and all of these things, which are my nonverbal working memory, and he can't. So it's fascinating how both of us are really ahead in one and very weak in the other. But because we are so good at the one, we have been able to mask the other for a lot of our life. And there's certain things that we just can't. My husband has covered it up. He doesn't like watching movies. I never understood why. He can't remember the storylines because that's his nonverbal working memory. It's so fascinating. So fascinating. And he used to say too, and I'd ask him about conversations with other people, like, what did they say? Or how was your conversation with somebody? Or how was your coffee? He goes, it was good. And he doesn't give a lot of details. And you ask him, he's like, oh, I don't remember, or I'm busy, or he'll switch the subject. He's learned how to mask it and shadow it because he doesn't remember. So it's so fascinating. And this can cause so much struggle with your kids academically at school, with remembering things that teachers have said, remembering things that you have asked them to do, and can cause so much frustration and so many problems in your house and with relationships with their friends, that it's really important for us to dive in. All right. We are going to go through the intake form questions for verbal working memory. I do have in the link below access to my intake form, or the self-assessment form that I have in the support circle. The support circle is, I love when people fill out this form for me. I can look at each individual executive functioning section with their child. So when they ask a question, I know where to be diving into, and it's super helpful for me. And my hope is if you go and click that link and go through this, you'll be able to really put a lot of pieces of the puzzle together with your child, really start to see why they struggle so much, why things that you have thought should be easy for them, why they struggle. And really start seeing things from a different lens and start realizing where you can start helping and supporting your child. Okay, intake form. When I'm doing this intake form, there are 4 answers to each of these statements. I call them questions, but they're statements. There's true, somewhat true, never, and in the past. In the past, as I said, is with a child where maybe they're through a different stage, maybe they've worked through it, maybe they have developed stronger skills, and then either the cognitive load, what's the work that's being thrown at them, becomes harder, that part, their verbal working memory starts to struggle again, or there's more stress happening in their life, which is decreasing the abilities of their executive functioning skills. So that's where in the past is really important for you to see if it's come back. So let's get to the questions. Verbal working memory: struggles to remember phonics, has difficulty repeating or remembering words, has difficulty repeating or remembering sentences or important facts, Struggles to repeat or remember phrases. Has difficulty rewording or expressing something in a different way. Appears forgetful. They often forget words, saying, I know what it is, but I can't think of the word. I do this all the time. And as I said, my verbal working memory sucks. I'm like, oh, I'll even say, I've said this my whole life. I'll go, oh yeah, I know the word that it starts with an S. And then when the word comes up, it never, I'm going to say never. There's sometimes I'm right. Rarely does it start with a letter that I even think that it starts with. So it's just fascinating where we say, I know what it is, but I can't think of the word. Is that true? Somewhat true, never true, or true in the past? Struggles to follow directions, unable to hold information long enough to complete the task. I find myself doing this where, like, if I have to look up something or write down something, or something's on my phone and I need to look at it quickly and write down, like the phone number or something, I have to look almost 6-8 times now in order to write down a phone number. It is crazy. I can't just look at something, remember it, and go and write it down. It takes me many times to look back and forth to even remember what it is that I'm supposed to be doing. So following directions as well, like if I have written directions out to get somewhere, I have to continually look at that paper because my brain cannot remember. Even it's as simple as walk 1 block, turn right. I won't remember that. That's verbal working memory. Has difficulty remembering and following verbal directions with multiple steps. So go upstairs, get your socks, and bring them down. I actually have to stop and visualize going up the stairs, getting the socks out, and visualize bringing them back down. That's nonverbal working memory. But if you just tell me and I run upstairs to do it, I'll be like, oh, shoot, what did you just ask me to do? I won't remember what you just asked me to do. Struggles to keep track of verbal conversations or instructions and remember what was said moments ago. Oh my gosh, this is even me with recipes. I will have a recipe and I can't remember, was it a teaspoon? Was it 2 teaspoons? How much of that did I need to add? I can't remember that. And I'll do that phonological loop of remembering 1 teaspoon, 1 teaspoon, 1 teaspoon. And I still struggle with that unless I actually visualize 1 teaspoon and actually visualize what 1 teaspoon looks like in my mind. Then I'm okay with it because I'm working on the nonverbal and putting the visual in. But if I just go from the verbal, I'm done. I'd be like, what did you just tell me to do again? And I can't remember it. So that's where I've been able to mask it. And now that I understand this, I could definitely work with this on my own, though I've done such a good job masking this most of my life that it doesn't affect me to the degree. There's times where I'm starting to see where it really does as I'm noticing it more and being aware of it, that maybe I should work on my nonverbal working memory. But I've been able to mask it so much because my verbal working memory is so strong that I'm not at the point yet where I want to work on it. So the next one is, has trouble remembering what they were going to say during a conversation. I do this all the time. You'll see there's times in podcast episodes where I'll pause. I'm like, what was I saying? Right in the middle of a sentence, I'll forget the topic I was talking on. I do this in conversations all of the time. And I feel like my brain just got instantly foggy. And I have to try to visually go back to remember what the conversation was. Or sometimes I have to say, what were we just talking about again? And as soon as they tell me, I'm like, oh yeah, and I'll continue on. Struggles to follow along in class or group discussions where verbal information is given quickly. If you're, do you know that game? I saw people doing it before where they're sitting in a circle and they're trying to remember everyone's names and they have to do this clapping in between and go through and remember everybody's names, and you have to repeat everybody's names. Oh my gosh, do you know that having that clapping in between makes it even harder to remember? And I can't do it because that's all verbal. I need to really, really visually remember that person to make it visual for me in order to do that, or I will suck at that game. Forgets what they were supposed to do right after being told. Frequently asks for repeated instructions, even when the tasks or steps have just been explained. Like, these are things that we get our kids into trouble for all of the time. And if their verbal working memory is struggling, we can definitely support it. But until we support it, we need to be a little more cognizant about how we're giving them instructions so that they can retain those instructions and follow them and do them, which could be giving them less information, less of a cognitive load, one at a time. Say, go and do this and come back and ask me for the next step. They might be okay with that. They might need it written down so they can visually see it. Have a checklist. Okay, do this. And then they can walk towards it. And if they need to look at the list again to see what you just asked them, then they're okay. So we need to come up with some strategies to help them right now to remember, and or while we're supporting them to improve and strengthen their verbal working memory. And the last one that we have is that they may have below average literacy skills. And it's fascinating because you might find that, as I was saying before, where they can tell you the sounds of every single letter in the alphabet, but when they have to remember the sounds of a full word, that's where they'll struggle. And you might find in that cognitive ladder where we were saying, a 3-letter word with its consonant, vowel, consonant is easier for them to remember than a 2 consonants together with the vowel. So ask. And that is where we have to see where is the chain breaking from them in order to help them with their literacy skills when it's coming from coming from the verbal working memory, and really diving into that. There's so many things to be doing to be helping a child with verbal working memory struggles, to help with their phonics, to help with them remembering of those sounds. And it's quite often not the way that they're being taught in school, which causes outbursts in school and frustrations and feeling of failure and all of these things. So the verbal working memory, it really isn't a one size fits all. It can vary so greatly depending on where the child is having difficulty, whether it's phonics, sounds, words, sentences, longer passages. And it's really, really important to meet your child where they are at, have them feel successful first, and then slowly build on that at a pace that works for them. In my support circle, that's where I answer questions and help parents out and help them understand how they can be supporting their child, how they can be strengthening the verbal working memory in order for them to be able to remember instructions better, in order for them to be able to work through and follow through with what you've just asked them to do, to really decrease the frustrations at home. All right, that was verbal working memory. I did dive a little bit into nonverbal working memory, and that's what we're going to be diving into next. I'm super excited about that one. It's going to blow your mind. So nonverbal working memory would be things like, does your child often lose track of where they left items like their backpack, or having trouble visualizing steps in a process? Do they lose their phone all the time? Do they not remember like a pen that's right in front of them? The nonverbal working memory issues can impact everything from organizing their spaces to navigating routines. And it can be so frustrating for both the kids and the parents. So I'm super excited to dive into that with you. Like, imagine the difference if we can strengthen that in them. It will not only help with the organization and independence, but it also opens up new ways for them to visualize and accomplish what they've set out to do. So I can't wait, and I will see you there.